Hey everybody, it is Wintermute coming to you from the think tank, and we are kind of picking up where we left off in the last video, but with a kind of different subject. Now, we are going to talk a little bit about some naval combat when we get into it, because it's a great chance to cover it, and the screening force rules. But here I want to kind of point out some of the interesting aspects that come from the turn order in which the nations take their actual take their turns, the order in which the nations take their turns. So, starting off with this scenario, the Japanese were done at the end of their turn, so we're going to start off with the Commonwealth. During the build phase for the Commonwealth, we are going to say that Anzac decides to lend lease a single infantry to KMT. Now, if you notice, there is no way for them to actually be able to lend lease at this point, because there's no port that the KMT controls that is open. We'll assume, for argument's sake, that this is Japanese controlled. But there's no port that the KMT control that they can deliver it to. But they're going to go ahead and do that anyway, because they're hoping that they're going to be able to remedy that before the place units phase, when they actually deliver the unit. And to do that, they're going to rely on this big British fleet, who's now decided that Japan's just gotten out of control. It's time to make our move. We see a way of really giving them, taking out parts of their fleet and giving them a real headache in China by reinforcing Nanking. So, this is the only build we care about for the Commonwealth, for argument's sake. So on their movement turn, the Commonwealth player can move. They have a major port here, so they get +1 movement to all these units here. Now, what that means is this torpedo boat destroyer can go 1, 2, 3, which is where they want to go. That'll become more important later. This battleship can also go here. They are out of movement. That'll become important in a second. Everything else, though, still has movement to continue. So this is what the British player decides to do. They declare, when they move in here, this is their screening force, and they're going to go ahead and throw in another destroyer just to be on the safe side. And the reason they decide to do that is because they see a potential issue here coming from the Japanese. Because when it comes to screening force, right now, we'll say this is now the end of the combat movement phase for the Commonwealth player. This is their screening force that is going to try and take on that one destroyer. Their combat move is done, so now it is Japan's turn to try and scramble. They actually have an airfield here, which they finished last turn, and 2 fighters. So they could scramble here and try to win that combat. And without that, that becomes, that becomes a much more difficult combat for the British. So they decide to throw in this extra guy here, and they think that's enough if they decide to scramble. They may not scramble. But the decision to not scramble isn't a decision they can change later, and I'm going to show what I mean by that. So, for argument's sake, we're going to say that they don't scramble, and that these guys soundly defeat this destroyer, and that now these guys' movement, their movement is done. They cannot move anymore, even though this guy had an extra movement point left. But that was part of the reason these guys were part of the screening forces, because they were out of movement. They couldn't have continued to move even if they wanted to. And then he was in there just to buff up to make sure that they won that. So then these guys now have the option to move again, to move up to finishing their movement and initiate another combat, regular naval combat, or an amphibious assault, not both. So using a screening force limits your options in the force that continues through. Now, the way I originally understood these rules is you could just, come here, screening force, these guys move, screening force, beat them, then the rest of the fleet moves, and you could basically, so long as you had movement, continue to do that. That's not how it actually reads when I reread the rules. Now, maybe an older iteration of the rules kind of worded it that way. I don't recall, but that's not the point. So I misunderstood that. I'm glad I took this opportunity to kind of reread it and get familiar with it better, because it hasn't come up in any of the games I've played. But reading it, this is how it works. So now they move here, and they're going to initiate a regular naval combat here. No special. They can't do another screening force or anything like that. Now, the Japanese player looks at this and starts sweating and goes, "Uh-oh, I'd really like to scramble those fighters," but his opportunity has passed. I'm already rolling combats, and the screening force movement, it happens after I've already started rolling combats. So there is no option to scramble these fighters from this zone into here. I'm going to adjust my positioning just a little bit here. There's no option for them to scramble into this second sea battle. They could have only scrambled into that screening force. That's the way I understand. And really the same thing happens with a blitz, because your combat movement ended with those units here. So if he wanted to scramble his fighter here, that was his only option to do so. They move here. Let's say this was Japanese controlled and he had a fighter here, but his opportunity to scramble into this combat would have passed at this point, seeing these units. Now, he could have scrambled with the airborne going in. That would have been enough to trigger a scramble here. But now that he sees that this guy's blitzing, he's already missed the opportunity to just scramble into this hex, because that round is already done. So I hope that made sense. Maybe I didn't explain it all that well, but if not, bitch at me in the comment section. So, with all that said, these guys are here. These guys come here, initiate their regular combat here. We're going to just wave our hands and say they win. All this Japanese stuff goes to the bottom of the ocean. And now, because there are no more ships that blockading that area, all these ports open back up. And that city is no longer considered surrounded. So now they get their defensive combat bonuses back, because the port is open, they can get supplies in. Now we're going to move forward to the place units phase, when we would deliver our Lend-Lease. And now the Anzac player can actually, with a clear line as the shortest route, count right up here, right into Nanking, and deliver their infantry. So you see how the timing there kind of worked out as well. Now we're going to move farther into that turn, and we're going to move to the point where it's America's turn. And America is going to go ahead and go, we're going to build an infantry and send it to Nanking as well. You know what? Actually, that's a major port. So we're not limited to 3 IPP of money or unit size, like we would be here if we were going to drop it off in Peking. So we're going to they actually have armor up there. So we're actually going to go ahead and deliver a tank destroyer. So now, in this instance, America can go ahead and do Lend-Lease straight to the KMT, straight to that area. Now, in this case, however, their shortest route is going to come through areas that have ships present, so there might be an interdiction roll. Let's say that the interdiction roll goes past, but he goes ahead and lands there. And you see how Britain was able to, because it goes before America, they cleared the path so American Lend-Lease could go into Peking. So the British player, we'll assume in this case, deliberately worked with the American player. Say, hey, I'm going to open that port back up. You get ready to reinforce it with whatever you can send with Lend-Lease, even if it's a little risky sending it through some of these ships out here. Another good example of that is, and I didn't set this one up, but the Italian player goes at the very end of the turn, and then the German player goes at the beginning of the next turn. So let's say the Italian player, the German. So actually, we'll go ahead and we'll actually look at the map